So, Cicero's on the nature of the gods. It's this debate that's taking place. There's a little bit of preface where Cicero is telling you about what he's up to, and he's got to get you to the point where these people are actually talking to each other. But for the most part, what is it? It's a discussion between these guys who you can say are friends. They're at least acquaintances. They know each other. One of them is a senator, which meant something pretty important back then. All of them are, they're all from the upper class or upper middle class, and they're all top-notch philosophers. So this is a bit different than what you had with Plato's dialogues, or this is a bit different than what you might have in some other dialogues. This is like having heavy hitters. It'd be like if you brought in, some big public intellectuals who really know their stuff, but they think very different things about important matters, and you put one guy over here, and another guy over here, and another guy over here, and you say, all right, go at it. That's what's actually happening in this dialogue. So it's at a very high level of sophistication. There's a lot going on here. There's a lot of information that's being passed on. That's in part a function of Cicero himself. So I want to tell you a little bit about this guy. Cicero was a Roman politician. He actually left some advice that has been used by political advisors, some of the top-notch people. He wrote a little piece on electioneering at one time because one of his friends, or I think nephews might have been, was running for office. But he wrote a lot of other stuff as well. Cicero made his bones as an orator, as somebody who would go into a situation, whether it be a law court or the forum, and argue a case. And if you want to argue a case well, you got to do two things in Cicero's book. You actually have to know what you're talking about. That really helps out a lot, right? But you also have to be able to use language well. So Cicero wrote a lot about rhetoric, about thinking, about how to order your mind and your words well. He also was somebody who'd studied philosophy very extensively. He was in the right place at the right time. When he was a young man in Rome, Greek philosophers were leaving Greece and coming to Rome, in part because Rome was becoming much more important, in part because there were a lot of disorders happening in Greece, and it was nice to get out of there. So he got to study with some of the big name representatives of the important philosophical schools of his day. And just imagine like if, Harvard and Yale, all these, Ivy League schools, there was some catastrophe and they all came to Marist. You could study with those professors, right? That's sort of what happened with Cicero. Then afterwards, and this is what a lot of young Roman men who had the money would do, he went and he traveled. Why do you guys do study abroad? Well, I think quite a few of you do. You're supposed to learn something, not just, hang out in Italy and have a good time, right? Or go to China and have a good time, or wherever else you go. You're supposed to learn something by travel, by going somewhere else, by seeing the world, right? Cicero was doing the same thing. As it turned out, Cicero spent a lot of time hanging around philosophy schools, both in Athens and in Rhodes. So there again, he got to meet some of the great philosophers. He comes back to Rome, takes up his, sort of full-time day job as being somebody who's taking part in running the country. And he does that for years. And then he's a contemporary of Julius Caesar. And what do you guys remember about Julius Caesar other than Brutus, stabbed him? What else? Why was he so important?
Didn't he conquer Gaul at the time?
That's how he sort of like made his reputation by conquering Gaul. Sort of like we have some, we've had a few military generals who became presidents, and they wouldn't have become president if they hadn't been a great general. So that was it early on in his career. What else? What did he do that was a fundamental transformation in Rome? Why were later emperors called Caesar? Yeah.
He changed the Roman Republic to a Roman Empire.
Exactly. Now, he didn't do it all at once. There was a triumvirate, and eventually these guys fell out. And then, Caesar himself takes complete power, but not complete power because it didn't keep him from getting a dagger from Brutus. And then, there's a lot of disorders after that, and then a new cabal comes to power with Augustus and Pompey, and was it Crassus? Crassus is with Caesar, I think, right? In any case, there's a lot of disturbances going on politically. What Cicero did, and what a lot of people in his class did, Cicero was for the Roman Republic. He didn't want a unified sort of regime. He wanted, everybody to be participating, at least everybody in the top crust. He retired to his villa and he started writing philosophy. He started writing these books that, you notice I've got this little red book here. This is the Loeb Classic series. This has the Cicero with the Latin and the English on opposite pages. And so, this is, if you're a Cicero scholar, you get yourself these things and you get a whole shelf of them because he wrote a ton of stuff. Now, what he wrote was not particularly original. He wasn't trying to create a new philosophy himself. And this is part of what actually makes Cicero so interesting and so valuable. He thought there were enough people out there who were already really smart, who'd already debated these issues, and what was his job? To sort of bring them together and see if he could get them to argue with each other, to make their case to each other. And so he knew each of these schools really well, and he could say, well, if somebody was a Stoic, they would say this. If somebody was an Epicurean, they would say this. This is the kind of arguments that they make. Here's the criticisms that they make of their opponents. Let me just bring these together. And so he wrote book after book, bless you, about different topics. And he would switch up the cast. So if it was something, he's got a book, for example, about fate. And in that, the Stoics are really the big target. So you got to have a Stoic talking, but then you can have some other people talking. In this one, it's about the nature of the gods, and so he's got these guys talking, and you'll see why in just a few minutes. So what Cicero did is he tried to produce something like an encyclopedia of philosophy, but an encyclopedia that would be in dialogue form. Now, why do you think he wrote it in dialogue form, if you had to speculate about that? Why not just do an encyclopedia with entries? You guys are all used to Britannica or Americana or whatever other, and say, well, Wikipedia is used to that, right? There's entries for everything. Wikipedia in dialogue form? No. To a certain extent, because people, add their bit, it gets taken out. But why do you think he wrote dialogues then? Just to, yeah.
Because he wanted people to think about it instead of just giving them the answer.
Yeah, that's an important element. He wants. We saw this with Plato. Plato leaves some gaps where you could actually say, yeah, but what about? And he does that, I think, deliberately. Cicero is doing something kind of like that as well. Is there any other reason, though, why he would use dialogue form? Yeah.
To keep in the old ways of philosophy.
Okay. There was a long-standing tradition of writing dialogues. Aristotle wrote dialogues, which we don't have, unfortunately. They were lost. A lot of other people wrote philosophical dialogues. So there is that. But why do you think he did that?
To show that it's opinionated, or so people can kind of think or use dictation from the wording that each individual would have used.
Okay. Yeah, he does actually try to replicate the style. And he talks about the Epicureans, for example, not having any style. That's an element of it. You're getting towards, he allows things to be personified. And things like this hit home with us better when we can actually attach them to a person. It's easier to remember. It's easier to keep in mind. When it's not just, the Stoic said, but actually Curator, who's saying this about the Stoics. And maybe he got it right and maybe he got it wrong. How did I put Gall? It should be Balbus. There we go. I don't know what I was thinking today. Or, Balbus the Stoic actually talks. And they get pretty excited, don't they, these guys? That you can convey in a dialogue. You have to struggle a little bit to get it through the diction and all that. But that you can convey in a dialogue, and you can't really do it in a philosophical text that's more like a treatise or a textbook. So let's talk a little bit about these guys who he's bringing up, and we'll talk about their philosophical schools. So this is happening at Cotta's house. Cicero goes next door. Cotta is his neighbor, and he says, Cotta says, "Hey, I'm glad you're here. We're in the middle of an argument, a debate. You can, join in, and I'll be happy because you're actually, on my side. You belong to my school." Cicero leaned more or less towards the academic school, at least on things like this. In other things, he adopted things from the Stoics or from the Aristotelians. But in this debate, at least about the nature of the gods, he would be an ally to Cotta. Does Cicero actually help Cotta out at all? Does he say anything after that? Not a thing. So Cotta's on his own. Does Cicero go away? I don't know if you've read all the way to the end of the dialogue. Does Cicero go away agreeing with Cotta? Anyone remember what happens? He says, I went away thinking Balbus actually was probably more right. So Cicero was willing to change his mind during the middle of this stuff. So who are these guys? Cotta is a member of the academic school. What's this academic school? Aren't all schools academic after all? Well, we get that the term from that. Remember who founded the academy? Anyone remember offhand? Talked about this a little bit earlier in the semester. Aristotle founded the Lyceum. Who founded the academy? Yeah.
Plato?
Plato, yeah. He actually made a school in Athens. That was a new thing. People didn't have actual schools, and he taught lessons. And according to Plato, at that time, you had to first learn geometry before he'd let you in to study philosophy, because geometry trained you to be able to contemplate the forms and stuff like that. Now, the academy had been around for quite a while, and you notice that its best student didn't get to be the next guy. Aristotle had to go off and found his own school, in part because he got passed over, which often happens in business, or in academic affairs, or in any sort of organization. Who do you think got the job after Plato? If it wasn't Aristotle, his best student, who also had some disagreements with him, who would you expect? Just imagine businesses that you've worked for. Socrates is dead by then. Remember, he's Plato's teacher, so can't be him. Who would you suspect it might be? If it's not the most talented person, then yeah.
Probably his son or something?
Yeah, somebody who has connections. It actually turns out to be his nephew, Speusippus. And Speusippus wasn't a dumb guy, but he wasn't Aristotle caliber. And then, there's a bunch of generations after that. I actually created a handout that I put in iLearn for you that lets you see, these schools, at least up until the time of Cicero. They all developed from Socrates, except for the Epicurean school. So the academy is coming from Socrates through Plato. And at a certain point, the transition to what we call the middle academy takes place. At first, they were all Platonists, right? So what would you expect them to believe in? The forms, doctrine of recollection, those things that I've had you guys look at before. Now, Socrates, if you think back to the Meno, and if you read some other dialogues, you would see Socrates saying things like, well, we don't really know anything. We're not even really quite sure what knowledge is. We just don't know that we have. We know that we don't have it. Think about, did they define virtue in the Meno? Did they ever succeed in that? In his apology, which is a speech that he gives before the Athenian assembly, where they're going to try him for capital crimes, he says, he tells a little story about himself, and he says, this friend of mine went to the oracle, and he asked whether Socrates was the wisest man in Greece, and the oracle said yes. And I said, that doesn't make any sense, because I'm not wise. I don't really know an awful lot. And so I went around and asked all sorts of people all sorts of questions, sort of like he did with Meno. And it turned out they didn't actually know anything either. I asked the politicians, turns out they don't know what they're doing. I asked the poets, turns out what they do is just by divine inspiration. I asked the craftspeople, they at least knew their craft, but then they didn't know anything outside of that. And you know why I'm so wise? Because I realize I don't know anything. because I'm not handicapped by thinking that I actually know what I'm doing or I know this subject. Remember back to when Socrates, got criticized for being the stingray and stunning people? That's him letting them know that they don't know things. So the academy, the middle academy, kind of seized on that. If you had to talk about that point of view and you wanted to use another word, you could call it being a skeptic. Being a skeptic doesn't mean just being a pain in the rear and bothering people with questions all the time. It means saying, I'm not really sure about this. I don't really know what the answer is. I may know that this isn't the answer and that's not the answer, but I don't actually have the answer. I'm looking for the answer. Skeptic comes from the word to seek out the answer. So that's what Kata is doing. You notice Kata is not really good at telling you what he actually does think. He's great at telling you what's wrong with what you think and why there's a good chance that could be false, and what other people think about the same things. But he never actually comes forward and says, here's exactly what I think. And that's what his school would do. They would argue both sides of a question, or multiple sides of a question. They were critical. They were analyzing other people's arguments because they thought, well, if you actually have a good reasoned account, it should be able to hold up to dialectical scrutiny. And if it doesn't, then we're actually, better off not buying into something that we're not actually sure about. And if you're talking about the gods, how much do we really know about the gods, or God, or divinity, or stuff like that? So we'll get to that in a moment. Velleius, does anyone remember what school he belongs to? I'll give you a choice. You're either Epicurean or Stoic.
Epicurean.
He's an Epicurean. So, what do we associate with that word these days? If you're an Epicurean, if I call you an Epicurean, is it a bad term, a good term, neutral term? What does it refer to these days? You've heard the term, right? Once in a while? I'll give you a hint. It's got something to do with that other college right up the road.
Oh, somebody that likes food.
Yeah. An Epicurean is somebody who really likes food, drink, takes a lot of pleasure in it. They might be a cook themselves. They're certainly a connoisseur of good food and wine and whatever else that you like. That's what it's come to mean for us. And the reason it's come to mean that for us is because the Epicurean school in ethics said that pleasure is the good. And, why do you eat fancy food? Why would you go up, and shell out good money at the culinary to sit in a fancy restaurant and have these, chefs in training serving you all this frankly, sometimes quite weird stuff, because it tastes great, because it looks great, because there's an experience that you want. That's what we've come to narrow it down to. But think about the whole other range of pleasures, right? What else do you guys find pleasurable besides food and drink?
Music.
Yeah, music is a big thing. It's interesting you can carry like a whole library of music around that the ancients would have been just, totally jealous of, yeah.
Sports, like hobbies.
Yeah, sports and hobbies, okay. We take pleasure in those. Sometimes we get pain out of sports too, but hopefully we get some pleasure too. What else? What else do we find pleasure in?
Books.
Reading, learning. Believe it or not, there are people who, not your age usually, but people who are much older, who take classes solely for pleasure. I know I miss actually being in classes. It's nicer being a student than being a professor in a lot of respects. Kind of miss actually getting to sit back and hear somebody else talk for a while. Yeah, the whole range of pleasures. Those are understood as being the good for the Epicureans. And I'll talk a little bit more about the other parts of their philosophy. But let's talk about Balbus now. So what does he belong to? He's the guy who belongs to the Stoic school. The Stoics themselves trace back to Socrates. The Epicureans don't. They trace back to Epicurus. And Epicurus got some of his ideas from Democritus, who was not connected with Socrates. And I'm not going to go into any great detail about that. What he got from Democritus was this notion that everything is made of atoms. And then he added a few other things to it. The atoms are continuously falling in a void, and every once in a while they swerve into each other and connect up. And that's what you're looking at right here. Like, you know, that person right there, and the desk that she's sitting in, are just a bunch of atoms arranged in different ways. How is she different than that guy? You know, different atoms arranged in different ways. And presumably, if we took, you know, some of your atoms and, you know, mixed them with some of her atoms, you know, we could like maybe put your head on her body and it would work, or something. You know, this that kind of science fiction things that we do in cartoons. Because it's all just atoms. It's all just, you know, compounds of those things. The Stoics had a very different view. They were materialists. They thought everything was a type of body, including the soul. But they thought things weren't up to chance. Like I said, they come from Socrates. Here's the way they come from Socrates. Socrates had a student called Antisthenes, who founds the Cynic school, and that goes on for a while. And there's a guy named Crates, who teaches a guy named Zeno, who also studies under a guy named Stilpo, who is from another Socratic school. And Zeno kind of mixes these things together and starts his own philosophical school, which is called the Stoic school, from the Stoa, which is the porch. He'd lecture on a porch. They were the porch talkers, you know. So that's the origin of this school, and it was a great school. Like I said, they were materialists. They thought, however, that there was some sort of reason or mind or soul that pervaded everything. They also thought something very different about the good than did the Epicureans. The Epicureans thought it's pleasure. Everything else, you know, we desire for the sake of pleasure. The Stoics thought that the good is virtue and freedom, and that pleasure is generally to be distrusted, because pleasure tends to get you in trouble, tends to ensnare you. Really what you want is to be completely rational and free and only occupy yourself with those sorts of things. They thought that the gods actually really cared about human beings. The Epicureans thought the gods don't care about human beings. So already you've got some big differences there. Why would the Epicureans think the gods don't care about human beings? The gods are blessed. You know, what is it like when you care about somebody? Is it fun and games all the time? Is it pleasure all the time? It's a pain. Just wait till you have kids. Then, you know, you got to care about all sorts of things that you didn't care about at all before, and that are going to bug you. So the gods, you know, if they're really going to be blessed, they can't have any connection with the world, human beings. They can't make things work. The Epicureans think the gods or God is active, pervading everything, providing guidance, even down to the level of, you know, like divination, prophecies, that sort of thing. So some very different conceptions of divinity there. These guys are going to square off against each other. And the general structure of the book is like this. There's a little meet and greet at the beginning, and then Velleius is going to talk. And what's Velleius going to do? He's an Epicurean, so what would you expect him to do? Well, it doesn't say that they're actually eating or drinking anything in this case. And this is a long discussion to have without any sort of drinks, I think. But what is he going to do in the talking? If he's an Epicurean, what would you imagine him to... Imagine, let me put it to you this way. You are put onto a panel, some sort of discussion, and you represent some school of thought that's very different than the other people on the panel. It's your turn to talk. What are you going to do? Yeah.
State your opinion immediately? Or
Yeah, that's a good idea. I mean, nowadays especially, with TV and sound bites, you better have something quick to start out with, some nice formulation. You're going to state your view. You're going to try to make a case for it. How do you make a case for your view when you have rival views? Is it enough just to state your view? Yeah.
Take some of their views and tell them why, not tell them why they're wrong, but why your view wasn't theirs.
No, I think you're right. You would actually tell them why their views are wrong. If you think that your views are the right views and they're different from these other people's views, then there ought to be some reason why their views are actually wrong. There ought to be some reason why they're mistaken in what they think is correct. And you'd actually be doing them a favor by exposing that stuff to them. Provided you're not doing it in an abusive way. Hey, you're so stupid because that sort of thing. Or just engaging in trickery. But if you really think that your views are right, it makes sense to tell other people why their views are wrong. That's what Velleius does. He actually starts out by doing two different criticisms. He criticizes all the philosophers, like all the way down to Plato and Aristotle. And then he says, and now you Stoics, you also have these crazy views that can't possibly be correct. And then after that, he tells what his own position is. And he tries to provide some reasons for believing in his position. So in Book 1, that's what's going on mostly. The hind end of Book 1 is Kata coming in and then trying to do the same thing, trying to say to Velleius, the stuff that you're arguing, you don't actually have any good basis for. And this is what a skeptic would do. They would attack other people's points of view, other people's arguments. That's what's going on in Book 1. Book 2 is almost all Balbus talking and presenting the Stoic point of view. And he presents arguments as well. And it gets pretty involved, pretty detailed. As a matter of fact, some of it I actually cut out of the text that I provided you because it goes into these long-winded discourses about poets and this happened historically and all that. And I thought maybe you'd find some of that kind of boring. But if you want to read the whole text online, you can. Book 3 goes back to Kata. And now Kata is criticizing the Stoics' point of view and giving you a little bit of his own point of view. So that's the basic structure of the work. So today, in what we have left, we're going to look at what this guy's saying, and then some of the responses, if we have time, that Kata is making to him. So let's think about the criticisms that the Epicureans are making of these other schools. So you've got these criticisms of everybody from Thales through Anaxagoras all the way down to Plato and Aristotle. And they basically boil down to this. This guy thinks this thing is God. This other guy thinks this thing is God. This guy thinks this thing is God. All these things that they think are confusing. I don't know, it doesn't seem to make sense why they would consider this thing to be God. It seems like they're just sort of pulling things out of the air. There's no intrinsic necessity for, whatever mind they think is out there. Where did that come from? How did that take place? They're not explaining things adequately. When it comes to the Stoics, it gets a little bit more specific. And he actually looks at some of the beliefs that the Stoics had. What were some of the things the Stoics believed? Well, some of the Stoics said that God was actually the natural law that pervades all things, or a rationality that's in everything, whether it's this podium, myself, you, the world as a whole, something tying us all together. So just imagine some essence pervading the entire universe. That's God. Or maybe it's the entire universe itself, understood as having a soul. Maybe that's God. Or maybe it's, and he goes on with a number of other things, maybe it is providence or fate. Maybe it's human beings that have been deified and made into God. And so the trouble is, You Stoics, this is what he's saying, you Stoics have all these different ideas, and you can't possibly hold all these at the same time. Which of these is God? Or, I mean, do you believe in God or the gods? You guys have to like pin it down, and until you do, we shouldn't believe you. See, that would be that'd be a reasonable thing to say to somebody. If you were in a debate with somebody, you could say to them, "Look, you've got all these ideas, and they sound like interesting ideas, but they don't fit together." And then the other person, they really haven't thought it through, would presumably say, "Yeah, maybe I gotta pick and choose among these ideas." So those are some of the criticisms that he's making. One of the criticisms that he's making is really interesting. And it has to do with a metaphysical issue having to do with time. Now, how do we generally think of time? Linear, yeah. What were you going to say?
Day and night.
Day and night, because there's an alternation, right? What do you mean by linear?
Time is always progressing in one direction. We can never alter the direction or flow of time.
Okay, yeah. We tend to think of things, we go from the past to the future, and, like here's the present right now, nope, now it's here, nope, now it's here, now it's here, keeps on going on and on and on, right? And what is history? Well, history is like, talking about this, what happened this time, and then if you buy the book before that, you get what happened this time, and maybe, there's another book before that about what happened in this time, and it's periods of time, right? You've always got time, don't you? Now, if you want to say, like Plato does, in a dialogue that I haven't had you guys read, but you could read, called the Timaeus, or if you want to say, like the Stoics do, that there is a creation, that the world, the whole universe, gets created by some sort of mind, that has to happen at some point in time, right? Now, who does the creating in this case? Some sort of god or gods. And then once you've got the creation, no problem, right? Creation has been created, keeps going on, the universe is there, does all sorts of neat things, time keeps rolling on. But here's the problem. There was a time before the creation. So what were these gods doing? Or what was God doing before that? Was he just sitting around? Was he sleeping? Was he just taking it easy because he didn't want to wear himself out? These are some of the suggestions that are being made. Here's the problem. If you have past before the creation, you got to be able to come up with some sort of account of why it was that God did this at this point in time rather than, say, here. Or why not here? What was he doing this whole time? Or it, or she, or whatever you want to conceive of God as being. This is a real deep metaphysical problem. And St. Augustine will consider this later on. He'll actually talk about this in a book that you're not going to read in this class, The Confessions. And he says, kind of jokingly, what was God doing before he created the universe? And he says, creating hell for people who ask questions like that. And he says, all right, jokes aside, now I'll talk about what he was actually doing. St. Augustine's answer is actually, there isn't any time before the creation of the universe. Because what is time? Time is change in the universe. But if you conceive of time as being something independent of the universe, as existing before that, then you got this problem of explaining, what was God doing all that time? Why didn't he act before that? And the Epicureans are bringing this up as a real, problem. For anybody who believes in sort of a traditional conception of God as being creative, all-powerful, creating the universe out of nothing, or out of some sort of seeds or something like that. Maybe that is a real issue. How do we often tend to think about this? We don't usually think about it so much in terms of God. People ask questions about what would be this special point for us in physics? The Big Bang, right? And then people say, what was happening before the Big Bang? And then the scientists say, nothing. Nothing was happening. There wasn't any time to be happening before the singularity. So, what you'd have to say is, time starts like this, and then it continues on forever. This is a deep metaphysical issue. We're not going to try to resolve this today. I'm just saying there's different models of this, but he's touching on something very deep. Yeah.
And doesn't this concept also go strongly against the pagan Greek gods?
Oh, cyclical time. Yeah.
Because even then, their gods, even in their own mythology, did not come first.
Oh, yeah.
They were created from other beings, which were created from other beings.
Yeah. In some of the poetic works, it's chaos, which is first, or something like that, and then you get the earliest gods like Uranos, which just means sky, and Gaia, which just means earth, and then only later on do you get the Olympian gods. Yeah, the Stoics thought of actually there being again, there's this sort of mind pervading everything, and that mind is actually fire. And everything gets resolved into, a universal fire at the end of things, and then that sort of blossoms forth into all these things that we experience. They get really hazy about this.
They must have really enjoyed Prometheus then.
Bring Earth fire? Well, it's yeah. They tended to allegorize, too. They tended to see a lot of these myths as just sort of expressing kind of, not literal truths, but figurative truths. That was the Stoics' view. The Epicureans didn't think they had a problem with this because their gods aren't creative. See, for the Epicureans, gods don't do anything. What's most fundamental for the Epicureans? Atoms, right? Atoms falling in the void and hooking up with each other. The gods are made of atoms. The whole universe is made of atoms. And you don't have to worry about some sort of creative mind arranging things and making things out of matter or making them out of nothing, because the gods don't care about that sort of thing. This is only a problem for people like, the Stoics or Plato, who's got a divine craftsman, or for Christians and Jews and Muslims who think that, God created everything out of nothing. So, if you start with this point of view, like Augustine does, then you don't have a problem. But if you allow there to be time backwards behind it, then you've got a real problem. Then you got to figure out what was God doing all that time that nothing was going on. Why wasn't he doing anything? So that's an interesting criticism. Let's look now at some of the stuff that the Epicureans are actually standing for. So, what does Velleius tell us about the gods and whether they exist or whether they do exist? Well, let's think about this notion, first off, of the gods being there, existing, but not being involved with things. What would that do to a religious point of view, like that of the ancient Greeks? What did the ancient Greeks do with the gods? Just trying to make pictures of them or statues? What's that? Idolize them? What does that mean, to idolize them? They'd make statues, but what would they do with those statues?
Like, look up to them and praise with his hands.
That's a very high-minded conception. Religion consists a lot of ritual, though. What kind of, yeah?
I was going to say they kind of bring them offerings, and when it comes time for harvest, or if you're a fishing village, then you would bring an offering to the god, so
Yeah.
it would bestow his niche on you.
Yeah, I mean, some of them, you read the Odyssey, they sacrifice hecatombs. That means 100 cattle. That's a lot of meat. And, the priests would eat some of the meat, and some of it get burned up, for the gods, and the idea was when the smoke goes up and they somehow consume it. A very materialistic conception of deity in that case. And now if you're an Epicurean, you say the gods, they don't care about that sort of stuff. You wouldn't do a sacrifice, would you? Save your money. They also, make offerings in the temple. You got saved at sea because you prayed to Poseidon. Well, you'd buy a little gold statue and put it in the temple. You'd give something. Would you pray if you had a conception of the gods as being inactive? What would be the point? Gods don't care about prayers. They're just up there somewhere, but they're not doing anything. What about, fortune telling or prophecies or stuff like that? Well, they're probably just people making stuff up. You can't rely on any of that because, again, the gods don't reveal anything to us. There's another thing to this, too. Epicurus thought this was a real good advance. If the gods don't care about human beings, what are some of the emotions they won't feel towards us? Love, right? That's not good. It'd be nice to have somebody love us upstairs, wouldn't it? But there's a flip side to this. If they don't love you, then what else don't they do? They don't hate you, like Poseidon hated Odysseus for gouging out his son's eye. What else wouldn't they feel towards you? What are some human emotions that you got to watch it when somebody feels these towards you?
Resentment.
What's that?
Resentment.
Resentment, although gods probably can't be that resentful, because we're usually resentful when somebody pushes us down. Well, what else? What's close to resentment? What's that?
Anger.
Anger, yeah. The gods, there's a lot of worry about angering the gods. Jealousy, too. Maybe the gods could get jealous of human beings. And in the ancient Greek stories, sometimes they did. So Lucretius, or not Lucretius, he's a later Epicurean. Epicurus said, look, the gods don't care about anything. We don't have to live in fear of them. We don't have to worry about their anger. We just have to do, the sort of things that we need to do for ourselves. And we can look up to the gods. We can idolize them in that sense. We can say, I'd like to be like them. Totally detached, just enjoying myself. Stay out of politics. That's the one thing the Epicureans would do. Just have some friends and make sure your friends are not the kind of people that are going to irritate you. That's the way the gods live. We want to be like them. We're not going to pray to them or anything like that because they can't actually help us out. All they can do is provide us a good example of what to be like. Now, he actually makes an argument. You might say, why is he doing this? I'll get to that in a moment. He makes an argument for the existence of the gods. And this is typically called the argument from common consent. And the way the argument from common consent goes, and it's not just Velleius who makes this, there's a lot of people who've made this throughout history. They say, well, if you look around at everybody, everybody's got some conception of God, something they worship. And, I understand this would be a problem for modern times because there's a lot of atheists out there, right? And there are whole societies that are officially atheists, like, say, Communist China. North Korea actually has its own weird kind of state religion, which is basically a cult of personality. So it wouldn't qualify as being totally atheist, but you get the, yeah.
Would you kind of say they're agnostic then?
Well, I'd say they actually have a very religious point of view. It just happens to be the state and the leader that's made into the religious object. Even mainland China is not totally devoid of religion. I don't know if I brought it up in this class or another class. One of the things that the state has been struggling with for like the last 20 years are taxi drivers and other drivers putting little images of Chairman Mao in their taxis with the belief that he's like a traditional Chinese god and will protect them from accidents, which are very common in Chinese traffic. But let's just go with where the ancient Greeks were. You look around at all the different societies. They all had religions, didn't they? They differed on the religion, right? It might be they pray to Osiris and Horus and Isis rather than praying to Demeter and Zeus and Hercules or something like that.
Or the Norse.
What's that?
The Norse. The Norse gods.
The Norse gods, right? They didn't know the Norse at that time, but yeah, they could have, imagine just traveling around the world, right? Everywhere you go, you'd find something being worshipped. So there is some common idea that people have of divinity. And what does this prove? This proves that there are gods. Because nobody's making them have this idea. It's not like the state is coming in and saying, you will all practice religion. That comes later on. All of these different cultures arrive at some sort of notion of there being something higher than human beings to worship on their own, independently of each other. After a while, when they get to know each other, they affect each other a little bit. They say, I kind of like that ritual they have over there. Let's take that on. Let's do that. But in the origins, each one of these religions, each one of these societies is doing its own thing. Now, how could they possibly be doing that if it didn't actually correspond to something real? This seems to be something almost, remember we talked about properties when we talked about Aristotle? This is a property of human beings, that they are the religious animal. Actually, let me introduce one more wrinkle before we start looking at how this could go wrong. With the Epicureans, they had this notion of a common conception. There's a technical term, actually, in their philosophy. The Greek for this is prolepsis, which means literally, lepsis is coming from lambano, which means to grasp, to pull in for yourself. Pro, that means before, right? So these are general ideas that human beings are kind of born with. They're hardwired into our very being, our minds, and we use them to make sense out of things. They're not Platonic forms because they're in our heads, and we use them to make sense out of the things that we experience. So all human beings, according to the Epicureans, have some sort of common conception of God, so therefore God must exist. Do you see any problems with this? Any ways this might not be completely airtight? This is actually the weakest of the philosophical arguments for the existence of God. Yeah.
Like, just because you can imagine something doesn't mean that it's real.
That's a big problem, isn't it? And they talk about centaurs, right? And none of these guys believed centaurs were real, even though the poets had talked about them. Every time they're referencing centaurs in there, they're using that as a purely imaginary object. And how do people make that? Well, you take torso of a guy, take a horse, cut its head off, and just plop it on there in your head, and there you go, you got a centaur. Now you can make them do all sorts of things in your head, like, prance around, shoot arrows, and, betray Hercules, teach Achilles, whatever you like. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily real. What are you going to say?
Like, if one society believes it, then it can spread to others. It's not just if one person.
So historically, it could have had
Yeah.
some common origin point. That's an interesting idea. I mean, it would have to be really, really early on, like before mankind diffused all across the world, because we see these different things arising more or less independently of each other, and then affecting each other later on. But yeah, if you could show that there was some common, our ancestors who marched out of Africa into the Middle East and Asia and Europe, and then across the Bering Straits and all that, somehow got to Australia as well. If you could show that those hominids actually were doing religion, then yeah, that would make sense. And again, you could also say, well, it doesn't mean that it's real just because they happen to believe in it. Any other problems that you can see with this? Yeah.
Well, humans are animals of curiosity, so a lot of people are going to say, well, prove it, show me physical evidence, I want to see it from my own eyes.
Yeah, when it comes to questions about the gods, you're never going to have physical evidence in the sense that you would if I say to you, don't eat the chalk, you're not going to like the way it tastes. You say, I have to prove this to myself, and you start munching on it, and you're like, oh yeah, that doesn't taste good. It's not that sort of thing. That's why we have philosophical arguments for the existence of the gods, because if it was just as simple as looking around, oh, hey, there's Zeus, we wouldn't have any debates, right? As a matter of fact, the Russians at one time were kind of goofing around when they first did their first manned space flight. One of their cosmonauts said, I looked around and I didn't see any angels, therefore the Christians are wrong about that. And then I was like, you wouldn't see angels floating around in outer space. That's not what Christians actually believe. But, people have that sort of There are some other problems with this too. And go ahead.
What about a person's perception of what a god would be? For instance, like a lot of people would place it on a physical being,
Mhm.
or for somebody else it could be that, you know, a deer to them is God because
So the fact that there's divergences in what they think are right. Okay, yeah, that's a good point. We'll get to that in just one second. So Kata raises some problems himself, and he says, look, one problem is not everybody does believe in the gods. You know, there are some people who actually assert the gods don't exist. There's atheists. There's agnostics. There's also people that are like practical atheists. He calls these the impious. These are people who say that they believe in religion, but then they act like they don't believe in it. And so, you know, can you really say that they actually believe in that case? If we all have a common preconception sort of woven into our being, then there shouldn't be any atheists, right? According to that. But, you know, maybe you can get around that by saying, well, you know, those people are mistaken. They're not paying attention to their preconceptions. They're perverse or something like that. And he says if we actually look at human cultures, though, we have a problem. Because, now the Greeks knew a lot, and the Romans knew a lot of different cultures. Some of the cultures that they knew, they thought were really barbarous, really savage. And they thought that these cultures, and actually it turns out they're wrong about this historically, but they thought these cultures don't actually have a conception of the gods. They may have some sort of vague, nature-based, you know, views on, you know, higher powers or something like that, like animism, but that's not yet notions of the gods. So that would be a problem, because that would be a different preconception. And then he says, even granting that if we do look at these different cultures, they all have some sort of religion, some conception of God. Here's where we get to this point. Is it really a shared conception? How do they think about the gods? I mean, if you think God is a deer, that seems to be a very different conception of God being some sort of human-like creature up in heaven calling the shots. Those are those really the same notion? I don't know. That's where it gets pretty weak. It doesn't seem like, this is one of the weaknesses of the argument for common consent, it doesn't seem like everybody is on the same page to begin with. And if that's not the case, you're not going to get the whole argument started. Even if you do, the mere fact that everybody believes in it, does that actually make it true? Are there other things that human beings, for a long time, everybody believed in, that turned out to be false?
Thought Earth was the center of the universe.
That's a big one. Yeah, you know, the ancient Greeks, the philosophical ones, they knew that the world was round. And they knew this in the Middle Ages, too. Because St. Anselm just mentions it offhandedly. He says, as we all know, the world is round. Meaning everybody who's intelligent. So this notion that everybody thought the Earth was flat, not true. But they did all think it was in the center of the universe. They did all think that wherever it happened to be, that was it. And everything else, you know, was around it. Is that the case? Turns out not to be the case. Yeah, so there's some things that we have believed in, and just because everybody has a belief about it, that doesn't actually make it correct. So this is a pretty weak argument. But people do make it, even down to the present day. There's another part to this argument, not being used to talk about the existence of God, but to talk about the nature of God, that Velleius brings up as well. He says that the gods must have a form similar to human beings. Now, think about this for a minute. If you believe in God, would you like God to look like a human being? Or would you like God to look like, I don't know, an alien? Or a deer? Or what else could we, you know, whirling disc of fire? Pick whatever you like. Why would you like God to look like a human?
Common ground. Show a connection between the divine and physical.
Yeah, you could relate to that kind of God a bit easier than, you know, a golf club, you know, or something like that. Yeah.
Well, I would say human, because I'm Catholic, and like most of my life, they told me to like identify myself with like who more like Jesus and God, but it'd be like more, and I was like, I don't know.
Well, I mean, you know, if you're a Christian, then you do think that God took human form, and, you know, in the form of this guy Jesus, who wandered around and got himself killed at about 34, 33 years old, you know, after talking a lot and doing some miracles and things like that. Right? And, you know, traditional Christian doctrine talks about being able to relate to God because God was like human beings. And the Greeks, you know, they conceived the gods to be more or less sort of like superhuman beings. You know, Zeus has arms and legs, and you know, you could make a statue of him with a long beard and looking a bit middle-aged, but still really tough and buff, because he had a more or less human form. Now, the Epicureans are saying that's what the gods are like, and he gives a couple arguments for that. So he says, look, human beings have a common preconception of gods like that. Go around and look at the different religions. That's how you always see God depicted. God must have a human form. And then he also says two other things that are really interesting. He says the human form is the most beautiful kind of form. It's the most well-adapted. Think about this. I mean, we do have a few people that are kind of weird fetishists who think that animals are more attractive than human beings, and sometimes they even do things with animals that you're not supposed to do, or at least according to the law. But most of us think human beings are most attractive, right? We're attracted to human beings, not to golf clubs, not to lamp posts, right? To human beings. We think human beings are the most beautiful form. They're the most attractive. Well, the gods are going to have the most beautiful form, aren't they? So it's got to be a human form. That's an argument. And then the other thing that he says that's really interesting, only a human form can contain intelligence. Again, let's look around. You know, dolphins are pretty smart. I don't see dolphins making iPhones or making calls on iPhones. We do. You know? What else are pretty smart? Chimpanzees, gorillas, they're pretty smart too. Not smart enough to keep themselves from getting wiped out, though, apparently. Not as smart as us. You know, we could run through the whole list. Octopi are just, in the invertebrate kingdom, are like the geniuses. They can do things like figure out complex puzzles. If they lived more than 4 or 5 years, we'd probably be in trouble evolutionarily, but they don't. And they haven't developed technology yet, so we're okay. Human beings seem to be the only rational animals. Gods are rational. Gods must have human form. So these are the arguments that Velleius is making about that. Cotta criticizes these. So that's where we'll actually leave off. Let's look at these criticisms. Is the human form really the most beautiful form? That's a good question to ask yourself. Good thing to think about. What is it that makes the human form most beautiful, if that is the case? Is the human form really that beautiful? If you read through the stuff that Cotta says about it, he brings up people with pimples and misshapen people, and if we actually go around and we look at real human beings, do they all meet this perfect standard? Think about celebrities. Have any of you guys ever looked at these pictures of celebrities without makeup? Some of them are just ugly, aren't they? You're like, wow, whoever gets paid to do the makeup job on that person, they're really earning their money, because I can walk down the street and find 10 people way more attractive than this person, So maybe our form really isn't that attractive. He brings up another worry too. Maybe the reason why we feel that the human form is the most attractive is because every single animal, by its nature, finds its own form most attractive. Dogs don't, go and, court cats, do they? Not most dogs. I've never seen a dog do that. That doesn't work. Dogs go and find other dogs. They like other dogs. Cats go and find other cats. We can go down the list, right? We don't have to go any further with this. You see where this is going. So maybe the only reason why we think our form is so attractive is because that's what we like. Is it really the case that we all have some sort of common conception of the gods as being human-like? Is that true in all cultures? Can you think of any cultures where the gods are something different? Yeah.
The Egyptians.
Yeah, the Egyptians, that's who they mention in here. The Egyptians said that a bull was God, Apis. And then, the gods that they had generally had like the animal heads on them, right? But you could say, well, they're still human, because they got arms and legs. Any other cultures that had gods that were, yeah?
Buddhism, or sorry, Hinduism.
Hinduism, yeah. You think of like Ganesh with the elephant head and things like that, or?
Or like Shiva with like a lot of arms.
Oh yeah, yeah. That's I never thought of that. That's a good point. Shiva. Now you know why he has a lot of arms? Because arms represent power. The more in Indian, sort of iconography, the more arms you got, the more powerful you are. So if you got 4 arms, that's good. If you got 8 arms, that's even better. If you got 100 arms, wow, you're a super god. Did you have your hand up?
No.
Oh, okay. Any other cultures that have non-human gods? Do you think of? Yeah.
Native Americans.
Yeah. If Coyote's a trickster god, Coyote's a coyote, right? So there you go. Or Wolverine is the example of that up in the north. He's the goofy guy. So there's some issues about that. We don't really have a common preconception that would make God have human form, even if the gods exist. What about rationality? If we look around at the animals that we know, we are the ones that are the most rational. Maybe dolphins are kind of rational, maybe chimpanzees are, I don't really know. If any of you are animal behaviorists planning on that, maybe you can help fill me in. Does that mean that only a human form could contain rationality? I mean, we're experimenting right now. Again, I'm not saying we actually could do this with an iPhone itself. We're experimenting with artificial intelligence, aren't we? Trying to create rationality in something that would be just circuits. We can create a lot of things that seem like rationality. That's one avenue we could go on. Could we imagine, some creature that didn't have human form that was rational?